The Robbie family consisted of Ryan, a successful 45-year-old investment banker with penchant for Brooks Brothers suits, his second wife, Mandy, a striking 38-year-old interior designer with a flair for the dramatic, and Ryan's son from his first marriage, 20-year-old Nathaniel, a college dropout with a chip on his shoulder and a history of minor run-ins with the law. To their neighbors, the Robbies appeared to be living the American dream. Ryan's career was thriving. Mandy's design business was gaining traction among Oakdale's elite, and Nathaniel, despite his academic setbacks, seemed to be finding his footing working at a local garage. Little did anyone suspect that beneath this carefully cultivated image lay a powder keg of secrets, jealousies, and dangerous desires. Ryan Robbie's first marriage to Helena, Nathaniel's mother, had been a whirlwind romance that quickly soured. Helena, a free-spirited artist, found herself stifled by Ryan's rigid lifestyle and expectations. Their arguments, once confined to hushed whispers behind closed doors, escalated into shouting matches that echoed through their home, leaving a young Nathaniel cowering in his room. The divorce, when it came, was bitter and protracted. Helena fought for full custody, painting Ryan as a cold, neglectful father. In the end, the court granted joint custody, but the damage was done. Nathaniel, then only 10 years old at the time, was torn between two warring parents, his loyalty constantly tested. Helena's subsequent move to the West Coast for her art career left Nathaniel feeling abandoned, fueling a resentment that would smolder for years to come. Ryan threw himself into his work, climbing the corporate ladder with single-minded determination. It was at a charity gala, 3 years after his divorce, that he met Mandy Rossi. She was captivating, with her raven hair and quick wit, a breath of fresh air in Ryan's staid world. Mandy saw in Ryan not just financial security, but a chance at the stable family life she'd never had growing up in foster care. Their courtship was swift, and within a year, Mandy had moved into the Robbie home. Nathaniel, now 14 and in the throes of adolescent angst, viewed his new stepmother with suspicion and hostility. Mandy's attempts to bond with her stepson were met with cold indifference at best and open hostility at worst. As the years passed, the divide between Mandy and Nathaniel grew. Ryan, eager to avoid conflict, turned a blind eye to the tension, convincing himself that time would heal all wounds. Mandy, frustrated by her inability to connect with Nathaniel, gradually withdrew, focusing on her burgeoning design career and the social circles it opened up to her. Nathaniel's teenage years were marked by rebellion, skipping classes, experimenting with drugs, and petty theft. Each incident widened the chasm between him and his father, with Mandy often caught in the crossfire. By the time Nathaniel grudgingly enrolled in the local community college, the Robbie home had become a battleground of unspoken grievances and simmering resentments, setting the stage for the explosive events to come. The catalyst for the Robbie family's unraveling came on a sweltering July afternoon. Nathaniel, having dropped out of college and now working as a mechanic, returned home earlier than usual, nursing a hangover and a foul mood. The house was quiet, Ryan away on a business trip and Mandy presumably at a client meeting. Seeking aspirin for his pounding headache, Nathaniel entered the master bedroom, a space he usually avoided. As he rummaged through the medicine cabinet, a buzzing sound caught his attention. Mandy's phone, forgotten on the nightstand, lit up with a new message. Perhaps it was the lingering effects of the previous night's indulgences, or simply a malicious impulse, but Nathaniel found himself reaching for the device. The message preview on the lock screen made his eyes widen. "Can't wait to see you later, my love. Axer." His stepmother's phone was locked, but this single message was a key to a Pandora's box of secrets. Over the next hour, Nathaniel sat on his parents' bed, his headache forgotten as more messages arrived, each one more incriminating than the last. He learned that the sender was one Xavier Krasinski, a name he vaguely recognized as a client of Mandy's design business. The messages painted a vivid picture of a torrid affair that had been going on for months. There were references to clandestine meetings, passionate encounters, and promises of a future together. As the reality of his discovery sank in, a mix of emotions washed over Nathaniel. There was disgust at the thought of his stepmother's infidelity, a twisted sense of satisfaction at having ammunition against the woman he'd resented for years, and beneath it all, a spark of opportunity. When Mandy returned home that evening, she found Nathaniel waiting for her in the kitchen, an unsettling smirk playing on his lips. The air was charged with tension as he casually asked about her day, his eyes glinting with newfound knowledge. Mandy, sensing something amiss, answered cautiously, unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. Nathaniel wasted no time in revealing his hand. With a casualness that belied the weight of his words, he mentioned Xavier's name, watching as the color drained from Mandy's face. He laid out what he knew, savoring each flinch and gasp from his stepmother as he recounted the details of her affair. Mandy's initial denials quickly gave way to desperate pleas as Nathaniel made his intentions clear. He wanted money, $1,000 a month in exchange for his silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years he'd resented Mandy's presence in his life, and now he saw an opportunity to profit from it. Her voice shaking, Mandy tried to reason with him. She spoke of family loyalty, of the pain this would cause Ryan, of the potential to tear their lives apart. But Nathaniel was unmoved. With cold calculation, he pointed out that it was Mandy who had jeopardized their family with her infidelity. He was merely capitalizing on her mistake. The negotiations were tense, with Mandy trying to bargain the amount down and Nathaniel standing firm. In the end, faced with the prospect of losing everything, her marriage, her social standing, her carefully cultivated image, Mandy capitulated. She agreed to Nathaniel's terms, her voice hollow with defeat, as she promised to make the first payment the following day. As Nathaniel left the kitchen, a sense of power surged through him. He had the upper hand for the first time in years, and he intended to make the most of it. Mandy, left alone, her mind racing as she grappled with the magnitude of her predicament. The first payment was made in cash, handed over in a plain envelope in the garage, away from prying eyes. Nathaniel counted the bills slowly, relishing Mandy's discomfort. With a smirk, he reminded her that this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, a new dynamic took hold in the Robbie household. On the surface, little had changed. Ryan remained oblivious, absorbed in his work. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, a current of tension crackled. Mandy walked on eggshells, her once confident demeanor replaced by nervous glances and forced smiles. Nathaniel, emboldened by his newfound power, became more openly disrespectful, knowing Mandy wouldn't dare challenge him. As summer waned, the weight of her secret and the strain of meeting Nathaniel's demands began to take their toll on Mandy. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would spiral far beyond her control. As weeks turned into months, the fragile equilibrium in the Robbie home began to crumble. Nathaniel, intoxicated by his newfound power, grew bolder in his demands. The monthly payments, once a source of smug satisfaction, now seemed paltry compared to the control he wielded over his stepmother's life. It started small. Snide comments at the dinner table, thinly veiled threats disguised as innocent conversation. Nathaniel would casually mention Xavier's name in Ryan's presence, watching Mandy's face contort with panic before smoothly changing the subject. He reveled in her fear, in the way her hands would shake as she poured the wine, in the dark circles that began to form under her eyes as sleepless nights took their toll. By October, the original agreement no longer sufficed. Nathaniel cornered Mandy in the laundry room, demanding an increase to $1,500 a month. When Mandy protested, citing the difficulty of explaining the withdrawals to Ryan, Nathaniel's eyes hardened. He reminded her of the photos he'd discovered on her phone, intimate images never meant for his eyes, and how easily they could find their way to Ryan's inbox. Mandy's world was unraveling. The stress of maintaining her secret life with Xavier, coupled with Nathaniel's escalating blackmail, was pushing her to the brink. Her design business began to suffer as she missed appointments and turned in subpar work. Clients, once charmed by her vivacity, now complained about her distracted demeanor and lack of creativity. As autumn progressed, Nathaniel's demands extended beyond money. He began to treat the house as if it were his own, throwing parties when Ryan was away on business trips, leaving Mandy to clean up the aftermath. He borrowed Ryan's prized vintage car without permission, returning it with mysterious dents and scratches. Each transgression was met with a pointed look that silenced any protest Mandy might have mustered. The power dynamic in the house had shifted dramatically. Nathaniel now ruled the roost, his every whim catered to by an increasingly desperate Mandy. She found herself walking a tightrope, trying to meet Nathaniel's demands while maintaining the facade of normalcy for Ryan. As Thanksgiving approached, bringing with it the prospect of extended family gatherings and increased scrutiny, Mandy knew something had to give. She couldn't continue like this indefinitely. With growing dread, she realized she needed help, and there was only one person she could turn to. In early December, Mandy made a decision that would set in motion a chain of irreversible events. After weeks of agonizing, she confided in Xavier about the blackmail. The meeting took place in a nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, their usual rendezvous point. As Mandy poured out the whole sordid tale, her voice cracking with emotion, Xavier's expression darkened. His initial shock gave way to a cold, calculating anger that sent a chill down Mandy's spine. What Mandy didn't know that Xavier Krasinski was not merely the successful businessman and charming lover she believed him to be. Beneath his polished exterior lay a history of violence and criminal connections that he'd carefully concealed from her. Xavier's past included a stint in prison for aggravated assault, associations with local organized crime, and a reputation for handling problems with ruthless efficiency. As he listened to Mandy's story, wheels began turning in his mind. This wasn't just about protecting their relationship anymore. It was about eliminating a threat. He assured Mandy that he would take care of everything, his tone soothing but his eyes hard as flint. Mandy, desperate for a solution and blinded by her feelings for Xavier, felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, she thought, someone else would shoulder this burden. Over the next few days, Xavier set his plan in motion. He reached out to old contacts, gathering information on Nathaniel's habits, his workplace, his favorite haunts. He was meticulous in his planning, leaving nothing to chance. Unbeknownst to Mandy, Xavier had no intention of simply buying Nathaniel's silence or reasoning with him. In Xavier's world, problems like this were solved permanently, and collateral damage was an acceptable risk. As Christmas decorations began to appear in the windows of Oakdale's homes, Xavier made his move. He approached Nathaniel outside the garage where he worked, his demeanor friendly, but his eyes cold. The conversation that followed was brief, but loaded with unspoken threats. Xavier made it clear that he knew about the blackmail, and that Nathaniel was playing a dangerous game. Nathaniel, however, was not as easily cowed as Xavier had anticipated. Years of resentment and the taste of power had hardened him. Instead of backing down, he sneered at Xavier, suggesting that perhaps Ryan would be interested in knowing about his wife's extracurricular activities. As Xavier walked away, his genial mask slipping to reveal a flash of genuine anger, both knew that the stakes had just been raised exponentially. The game was no longer just about money or secrets. It had become a battle of wills, with potentially deadly consequences. The week before Christmas, Xavier decided to take more direct action. His warning to Nathaniel had fallen on deaf ears, and he knew that Mandy was at her breaking point. Under the guise of a pre-holiday drinks invitation, Xavier lured Nathaniel to a secluded area near the old mill on the outskirts of town. The winter air was crisp. He offered a substantial sum, $50,000, for Nathaniel to leave and never contact Mandy again. It was meant to be a final generous offer before resorting to more drastic measures. Nathaniel, however, had severely underestimated the danger he was in. Emboldened by months of successfully manipulating Mandy, he scoffed at Xavier's offer. In a display of youthful arrogance, he countered with an outrageous demand: $250,000, or he'd expose both Mandy and Xavier to Ryan and the entire community. What happened next was a blur of motion and violence. Xavier, his patience exhausted, lashed out with a speed and ferocity that caught Nathaniel completely off guard. The ensuing struggle was brief but brutal. Xavier's experience and ruthlessness quickly overwhelmed Nathaniel, leaving the younger man battered and bloodied on the frozen ground. As Nathaniel lay there tasting blood and fear for the first time, Xavier delivered a final warning. This was his last chance to walk away, to forget everything he'd seen and heard. The next time, Xavier promised, there would be no warnings, no offers, only consequences. Shaken and in pain, Nathaniel stumbled home that night, his mind reeling. The reality of his situation had finally hit home. He was no longer the one in control. He was in over his head, tangled in a web far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. For a brief moment, as he nursed his wounds in the solitude of his room, Nathaniel considered taking Xavier's advice and disappearing. But as the pain of his injuries gave way to a burning anger, his resolve hardened. He wasn't going to be intimidated. If anything, this attack had only strengthened his determination to see this through to the end, whatever that might be. As Christmas approached, the atmosphere in the Robbie home grew increasingly tense. Mandy, already stretched to her breaking point, now had to contend with Nathaniel's escalating demands and increasingly erratic behavior. The bruises from his encounter with Xavier had faded, but his anger had only intensified. Ryan, no longer able to ignore the palpable tension, began asking more pointed questions. The cracks in Mandy's carefully constructed facade were beginning to show, and she found herself struggling to maintain the illusion of normalcy. It all came to a head on Christmas Eve. The Robbies were hosting their annual holiday party, the house filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Mandy, dressed in a stunning dress, moved among the guests with practiced ease, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Nathaniel, sullen and nursing a whiskey in the corner, watched his stepmother with barely concealed contempt. As the night wore on and the alcohol flowed freely, his inhibitions lowered dangerously. In a moment of reckless anger, he approached Mandy as she chatted with some of Ryan's colleagues. Whispering in her ear, he demanded another payment, $5,000 this time, by the end of the week. When Mandy, her face pale but composed, tried to quietly reason with him, Nathaniel's control slipped. Mandy, her heart pounding, quickly excused herself and practically dragged Nathaniel to the study. Once there, she unleashed months of pent-up fear and frustration. In hushed but intense tones, she told Nathaniel that she was done. She wouldn't pay him anymore. If he wanted to tell Ryan, then so be it. She was tired of living under the weight of his threats. Nathaniel, caught off guard by her sudden defiance, lashed out verbally, threatening not just to expose her affair but to destroy her reputation, her marriage, her entire life. He stormed out of the study, leaving Mandy trembling but oddly relieved. She had finally stood up to him, consequences be damned. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Mandy knew she had reached a point of no return. Something had to be done, and soon. With shaking hands, she reached for her phone and sent a text to Xavier. "We need to talk, it's urgent." January 15th dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the tragedy about to unfold. Mandy had spent the weeks since Christmas in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at every sound, flinching every time Nathaniel entered a room. Her conversation with Xavier had been brief but intense. He had listened to her desperate pleas, his face an unreadable mask, and simply said, "I'll take care of it." Those words, which had initially brought her relief, now haunted her. What exactly did Xavier mean? As much as she wanted an end to Nathaniel's blackmail, the thought of what that end might entail filled her with dread. Nathaniel, for his part, had been unusually quiet since the Christmas Eve confrontation. He seemed to be weighing his options, unsure of how to proceed now that Mandy had called his bluff. The uncertainty only added to the suffocating tension in the house. That evening, Ryan was working late, as he often did. Mandy sat in the living room, absently flipping through a magazine, her mind elsewhere. The sound of Nathaniel's car pulling into the driveway made her stiffen. She heard the front door open, his footsteps in the hall, then silence. Upstairs, Nathaniel entered his room, his mind made up. He was done playing games. Tomorrow, he would tell his father everything. Let the chips fall where they may. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching his door. The knock, when it came, startled him. Expecting Mandy, he opened the door with a sneer already forming on his lips. The sight of Xavier standing there, his expression grim, wiped the sneer away instantly. What happened next was a flurry of violence that lasted mere minutes, but would have repercussions for years to come. Xavier forced his way into the room, closing the door behind him. Words were exchanged. Threats, pleas, desperate bargaining. But Xavier hadn't come to negotiate. The first blow caught Nathaniel by surprise, sending him stumbling back against his desk. He fought back, his youth and desperation lending him strength, but Xavier's experience and cold determination proved too much. The struggle was brutal but brief. Downstairs, Mandy heard the muffled sounds of the fight, her heart racing. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, paralyzed by indecision and fear. A part of her knew she should intervene, call for help, do something. But another part, the part that had endured months of torment and blackmail, kept her rooted to the spot. The silence when it fell was deafening. Mandy's legs trembled as she forced herself to climb the stairs. She found Xavier standing in Nathaniel's doorway, his shirt spattered with blood, his eyes cold and empty. Behind him, she caught a glimpse of a still form on the floor and had to stifle a scream. Xavier's voice was calm, almost soothing as he guided her back downstairs. He spoke of accidents, of self-defense, of necessary evils. Mandy heard the words but couldn't process them. All she could think about was the sight of Nathaniel's lifeless body, and the knowledge that in a way she was responsible for what had happened. As Xavier methodically began to clean up, to erase the evidence of what had transpired, Mandy sat in the kitchen, her mind reeling. The nightmare she had been living for months had just taken a turn she could never have imagined, and she knew with chilling certainty that her life would never be the same again. The hours that followed Nathaniel's death were a blur of frantic activity and cold calculation. Xavier, drawing on skills honed through years of criminal association, took charge of the situation with ruthless efficiency. Mandy, still in shock, found herself following Xavier's instructions mechanically. They cleaned the room meticulously, removing any trace of Xavier's presence. Nathaniel's body was wrapped in a tarp from the garage, then loaded into the trunk of Xavier's car under the cover of darkness. As dawn broke, Xavier drove away with grim purpose, leaving Mandy alone in the house with the impossible task of maintaining normalcy. When Ryan returned home later that morning, exhausted from his late night at the office, Mandy forced herself to greet him with a smile that felt like it might shatter her face. The day passed in a haze of mundane activities and internal panic. Mandy cooked, cleaned, and chatted with Ryan, all while her mind screamed with the knowledge of what had happened. When Ryan casually asked about Nathaniel's whereabouts, Mandy heard herself reply that he had mentioned going on a road trip with some friends. As days turned into weeks, the lie grew more elaborate. Mandy created a digital trail, sending emails from Nathaniel's account to Ryan, describing fictional adventures in various cities. She fielded concerned calls from Nathaniel's workplace, spinning tales of family emergencies and extended leaves of absence. Xavier had disposed of Nathaniel's body in an abandoned quarry several hours away, weighing it down to ensure it wouldn't be found. He meticulously eliminated any evidence that could connect them to Nathaniel's disappearance. For a while, it seemed their hastily constructed cover-up might hold. Life in Oakdale continued, with only a ripple of concern about Nathaniel's prolonged absence. But as winter gave way to spring, and Nathaniel's silence stretched on, questions began to multiply. Ryan's initial unconcern turned to worry, then to suspicion. Mandy found herself trapped in a web of lies that grew more complex and fragile with each passing day, knowing that it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Detective Sandra Sloan had seen her fair share of missing persons cases in her 15 years with the Oakdale Police Department, but something about Nathaniel Robbie's disappearance nagged at her from the start. The pieces didn't quite fit. The sudden departure, the sporadic communication, the lack of financial activity. As spring bloomed in Oakdale, Detective Sloan dug deeper into the Robbie family dynamics. She interviewed friends, colleagues, and neighbors, slowly piecing together a picture of a household fraught with tension. The more she learned, the more her suspicions grew. Ryan Robbie, initially reluctant to involve the police, became an increasingly vocal advocate for finding his son. His faith in Mandy's explanations had begun to waver, and he pressed for a more thorough investigation. This pressure, combined with Detective Sloan's relentless pursuit of the truth, began to expose the cracks in Mandy's carefully constructed narrative. The breakthrough came in late April, when one of Nathaniel's co-workers at the garage came forward with crucial information. He recalled overhearing a heated argument between Nathaniel and Mandy just before Christmas, with mentions of money and threats. This revelation shifted the entire focus of the investigation. Detective Sloan brought Mandy in for questioning, subjecting her to hours of intense interrogation. Mandy, worn down by months of guilt and fear, began to falter. Her story, once seamless, now showed inconsistencies. She stumbled over dates, contradicted her earlier statements, and grew visibly agitated when pressed about her relationship with Nathaniel. As Mandy's composure crumbled, Detective Sloan sensed she was on the verge of a breakthrough. She decided to take a risk, bluffing about evidence they didn't actually have. She mentioned phone records showing frequent contact with an unknown number around the time of Nathaniel's disappearance, implying they knew about Xavier's involvement. The gambit worked. Mandy, believing the police knew far more than they actually did, broke down. Through tears and gasping sobs, she confessed to the affair, the blackmail, and her knowledge of Nathaniel's fate. She implicated Xavier, portraying herself as a terrified bystander to his actions. With Mandy's confession, the case broke wide open. An APB was issued for Xavier Krasinski, and search teams were dispatched to the quarry where Nathaniel's body had been hidden. As news of the confession spread through Oakdale, the community reeled from the shocking revelations. The picture-perfect family on Maple Street had harbored darker secrets than anyone could have imagined. In the days following Mandy's confession, Oakdale became the center of a media frenzy. News vans lined Maple Street, reporters clamoring for any tidbit of information about the scandalous murder that had rocked the quiet suburb. Detective Sloan, now heading a task force dedicated to the case, worked tirelessly to bring all the perpetrators to justice. Thanks to Detective Sloan's skillful coordination with state and federal authorities, Xavier was apprehended at a bus station in Nevada, attempting to cross into Mexico. His arrest was the final piece of the puzzle. Under intense interrogation, Xavier eventually corroborated much of Mandy's story, though he attempted to paint himself as a man driven to desperate measures by love. He revealed the location of key evidence, including the murder weapon and some of Nathaniel's personal effects, which he had kept as a twisted sort of trophy. As the full extent of the conspiracy came to light, the impact on those involved was profound. Ryan Robbie, confronted with the brutal truth of his wife's infidelity and his son's death, withdrew from public life. Friends reported that he seemed a shell of his former self, devastated by the twin betrayals of the two people he had trusted most. The community of Oakdale, once so proud of its safe, wholesome image, was forced to confront the darkness that had festered beneath the surface. For Detective Sloan, the resolution of the case was bittersweet. While she took pride in unraveling the complex web of lies and bringing the perpetrators to justice, she couldn't shake the feeling that if she had pieced things together sooner, a young man's life might have been saved. In the end, justice was served, but it brought little comfort to those most affected. Xavier, with his history of violence and his role as the primary actor in Nathaniel's death, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mandy, despite her attempts to paint herself as a victim of circumstance, was found guilty of conspiracy and accessory to murder. She received a 25-year sentence, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Ryan Robbie, a broken man, sold the family home and left Oakdale, unable to bear the constant reminders of his loss and betrayal. He retreated to a quiet life in another state, where he could grieve in private and attempt to rebuild some semblance of a life. The case left an indelible mark on Oakdale. The community, once known for its low crime rate and family-friendly atmosphere, now found itself grappling with a new, unwelcome notoriety.